First, you might question, I don't know, why do I want to help a psychopath? Their statistical rarity suggests little practical benefit, right? High representations, however, in prison populations and high recidivism suggests the potential for a large impact. Making a positive impact on the prison population and on people in powerful positions outside of prisons has the potential to make a disproportionately positive impact on society, given the outsized negative effects of harm and violence from them on people and communities typically. Because of the persistent biological influences of psychopathy, genetic and neural, for example, their risk of offending is persistent. It's not something that occurs during the rebellious adolescent period, for example, and drops off in adult life. That is called adolescent limited offending, and that is not the kind of offending psychopaths typically have. This suggests that there's these persistent biological influences that are going to be very difficult to approach in a therapeutic way. However, these biological factors do interact with social and behavioral interventions as people grow up. Assistance can be introduced earlier when neural connections are still forming. Early intervention might give an individual a better chance of becoming engaged with behavioral tools. Starting early with interventions might be a good idea. What kind of interventions? What would this look like? One consideration that we just saw in all of the research on abstract processing is the use of simple and concrete terms. This would take into account that people high in psychopathy are more likely to be having difficulties processing abstract terms in the way that you might intend them to interpret these terms. So this could mean rewording or redesigning your intervention to use concrete terms rather than abstract terms. I want to go over exactly what that might mean. So abstract language refers to qualities and ideas. Concrete language appeals to the senses. If a word is concrete, you'll know which of the 5 senses it appeals to. Does it appeal to sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing? This kind of description is more useful to people often because it offers more vivid details. But sometimes abstract language seems necessary. The challenge then is trying to find new ways to communicate important concepts using concrete language. For example, writing a motivational reward prompt using concrete language only. Humans generally process concrete language more efficiently, we saw, so that will improve the processing of your information regardless of neural deficit situation. Another key point for interventions to keep in mind is the organic basis of their difficulties and how it imparts limitations on learning. It's been pointed out over and over by neuroscientists and clinicians that psychopaths just don't learn from punishment because of the lack of emotion. They don't care. They tend to engage in arms race. They have difficulties with authority and rules and can't seem to perceive of the long-term values of cooperation. So it's fruitless to use punitive behavioral modification with this population. This is connected to those neural findings that we covered, showing reduced amygdala response and low heart rate. They're not showing high arousal, which is needed to learn from punishment. Besides not being motivated by punishment, psychopaths also lack typical moral motives, as we saw in Glenn and colleagues' findings during the Moral Self Week. People higher in psychopathy are lower in moral identification, such that the moral traits are not the kind of things that they would say describe them well. This doesn't mean that these individuals don't want to live, deserve to live, and try to be good. It does suggest that their behavior is going to be difficult to change with normative moral motives and motivators. Their behavior, however, it can change, as the material in the videos show. Little battles with institutions can lose their primary importance, and these violent patterns can stop as other values related to normative society, if not fully moral values, gain importance. So let's see how that's done. The goal for psychologists is to free that individual from institutional conflicts and motivate them to pursue conventional goals. Psychologists design interventions around incentives that the individual values, like material rewards. And the individuals are noticed and rewarded relatively small amounts for relatively small amounts of positive behavior. And this reward is consistent. This, of course, requires withholding moral judgment and anger about ethics as the person makes errors. But Keel describes how youth have been motivated to maximize their positive qualities this way and get them out into the world in ways that were better received. They even observe psychopathy scores go from severe to normal. Let's look closer at the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center. This is a residential facility that provides mental health treatment to serious and violent juvenile offenders. Youths are typically transferred to this center when they're unresponsive to the rehabilitation services provided by the Department of Corrections. The residents at this center are shown to have a youth psychopathy checklist score, typically in the severe range, so around 28 out of 40, and they're mostly teen boys. The Today Tomorrow program is used, and it's a behavioral points system, and this is where the rewarding comes in. The system aims to improve hostility toward authority figures and strengthen connections to desirable social behaviors, beliefs, and relationships. How it works is adolescents earn privileges following relatively short periods of positive behavior. Ultimately, the time in treatment is remarkably short, so it averages around 45 to 83 weeks. What is really going on in that effective treatment? Well, the overarching theoretical background for this behavioral modification training is the decompression treatment model. And this proposes that there's a cyclic pattern of counterproductive defiance against authority figures that occurs when a defiant response to punishment or correction is itself punished, producing more defiance and further punishment. Increasing punishment then further removes the alienated youth from conventional goals and values, and it compresses them in. It forms a compressed antagonistic behavioral pattern. Current juvenile correction systems can involve compression by repeated punishment in long periods of cyclic, counterproductive control and defiance. Decompression attempts to, quote, erode aggressive adolescent offenders' defiance of authority figures. And it does this with continuous monitoring of behavior and consistent reinforcement of positive behavior and pro-social bonds. Studies show that it seems to work. It's more effective at reducing violent crime by juveniles than standard juvenile correctional institutions. Youth in the center program are 6 times less likely to engage in felony violence than the comparison group of youth in corrections. Also, reoffense was delayed, and the youth committed less violent offenses. They also found that length in treatment predicted improvements in interpersonal functioning and behavioral control. So the longer they stayed in that program, the more efficacy it had. Okay, we've discussed a lot of different aspects of psychopathy and the clinical perspectives on the psychology of evil. We looked at behavioral measures of psychopathy, linguistic analysis that is a window into psychopathy, and neural studies that point out different parts of the brain responsible for deficits in psychopathy. We also looked at potential treatment for psychopathy. Your post is related to that. So in this post, imagine that you are the director of clinical services for the incarcerated residents at a progressive high-security prison. A new intervention program is beginning for the residents, which has been found to be beneficial for inmates who score high on the PCLR. Based on what you've learned about psychopathy, what features would you expect in this new intervention program? What psychological or neural issues are these features meant to address? Provide some examples of the interventions and what you imagine they'd be like for the inmates.